I'm going to talk about situational awareness. Wardley mapping is a tool for building situational awareness, essentially. So I just wanted to dig into what I understand situational awareness to be. Look at some other types of complementary situational awarenesses. I think, so I gave a webinar on this back in February, where we talked about, let me just switch back to this while I chat. So we talked about situational awareness in the context of tech startups. So I think Wardley mapping is an excellent tool for building situational awareness at the strategic level. But I think there are a couple of other levels that we would do well to understand how they interact. So let's dig back into the slides. So there's a whole bunch of situational awareness resources on Wikipedia. There's been interestingly, some research done in the US Air Force, but it appears not in conjunction with John Boyd. Now, John Boyd obviously was the guy who came up with the OODA loop, one of the inspirations for Simon coming up with Wardley mapping. So it's quite interesting that the academic research that's been done on situational awareness was done in the US Air Force, but Boyd doesn't appear to have been involved in it because, as I'll show later, I'm not sure if I've got the image in this slide, in this slideshow. Situational awareness is sort of one half of the OODA loop. So let's crack on. In fact, I do have it in the slide. Happy days. So situational awareness then. So this image is taken from some of the research on our Wikipedia, and it has the following kind of definition. So it's the decision and the performance of action. That's the decision and action from the OODA loop, and the situational awareness actually corresponds, I believe, quite closely to the observe and orient part. Now, if you've only familiar with the OODA loop as a loop or a circle with 4 things on it, well, I'm here to tell you that you've been grossly misled, and actually it's much more complicated than that. So that's situational awareness, the concept. Now they further on some of the academic research they've done, they split the kind of building of situational awareness into 3 phases, which are overlapping and sort of interrelational. So perceive, that's observe essentially. Process is the orient part. So it's contextualizing, interpretation. It's figuring out what does this mean or why do we care. And then there's a bit that doesn't get talked about so much, which is projection, right? There's not really much point orientating, processing a whole bunch of stuff. Humans are pattern building machines. So what we always do is project what we've seen into the future. So, this is why we care about this. And this is how we think what we've observed is going to affect us. And then from the projection of what we project into the future, then we go and plan and decide and act. But it's quite important to recognize that step happens. So for example, if you're doing Wardley mapping, the projection part is when you extrapolate from the map that you've built, and you run your evolution through in your head. So you move things to the right and you see what that does. That's essentially the projection part of situational awareness at the strategic level. So I find it useful to split situational awareness into 3 timeframes and 2 different perspectives. Now, the 3 timeframes actually, I've got a book on my shelf called Warfighting by the US Marine Corps, which my understanding is that John Boyd had a massive hand in helping them write. And I'm not sure if people on the in this presentation are aware, but Boyd actually found his sort of spiritual home with the US Marine. So a lot of the US Marine Corps doctrine, ways of doing things, how they think about learning is actually inspired by Boyd. Now, so if anyone knows anything about the military, to have Marines listen to an Air Force guy is pretty incredible. So what do we got? We've got the tactical time frame. So this is, actions you're taking as an individual or in small groups. It's days to weeks. So, this is, shipping a batch of code to master into CI. This is the kind of iterative multiple loops that we all go through at the kind of leaves of the organization, of an organization. And then the operational time frame is essentially aggregating a batch of tactical OODA loops, if you like, towards an objective. So, if we've got a bigger chunk of work that we want to achieve, let's say we've taken a strategic decision to move a component from one part of a Wardley map to another, then you would that down into operational situational awareness of, how's that going? Are we on track to deliver that? And further, that operational awareness would be aggregating a whole bunch of nested tactical timeframes. And then strategic is, the kind of big picture decision making of, what are the macroeconomic conditions. I mean, this is, business, in terms of business, in military context, that would be, what's the sort of 6-month operation that we've been deployed to tackle. And then two perspectives that I think are quite useful are splitting into internal and external. So internal is inward looking, right? If you're an organization, you are made up of multiple nested levels of teams, or whatever you want to label those subdivisions. So situational awareness is what's happening within your organization, and external situational awareness is what's happening outside. Now, due to the overlapping nature of these timeframes, you can think of the external tactical situational awareness as encompassing the internal operational situational awareness, if you like. So what that means is that, your internal operational situational awareness is what's going on with my tactical teams. What are they up to? How's it going? What problems are they having? What do they need me to unblock? So that's very much internal from the perspective of the operational, people or, management or whatever. And from the tactical team's point of view, if you consider their boundary as their team, then the external environment from the point of view of their team also encompasses the higher up of the organization. So their tactical awareness, their tactical situational awareness has to encompass both the external environment that they observe, but also their sort of higher up, if you like. Okay, so the structure of situational awareness. So I like to split these into the debrief and the plan. I see Corey's on the call, so maybe during the Q&A we can talk about these aspects of these aspects of operations in the context of sort of what's the word, incident response that you're familiar with, and then the military as well. So in the military, there's a very strong culture of a debrief after every operation. So no matter how knackered you are, you come back, you immediately, while it's fresh, you sit down and you do a debrief, which is essentially where you process what's happened and you learn your lessons. Now, depending on how tight your operational environment is, your timeframes, you might roll that straight into planning. So it's almost like a co-recursive process. I love recursion. I'm a functional programmer. I can't help it. So let's dig into these individually. I will keep glancing over at the other. So I've got my other screen over here with the webinar UI. So just leave any messages, and I'll check the chat periodically. Okay, cool. Right, cool. Okay, so let's crack on. So the debrief then. So the debrief is what, if you work in technology or a tech company, you may have heard of as a retrospective. So, a sprint has a retrospective. I happen to think that a retrospective is a pretty anemic version of a debrief. So I'll go through what I think, a proper debrief should look like. And, if you can take anything to sort of enrich your retrospectives, then that's a good outcome. So what the aim is here, right? You've got these 3 different time frames, which obviously aren't a real thing, and they're just a categorization that I've sort of made up in order to have a conversation. So if you've got tactical teams going away and executing on the order of hours or days, and then you've got operational teams aggregating that information and operating of the order of sort of weeks, days to weeks, at some point you have to come up with a cohesive view of the world. And the way that I've experienced that happening in the military is the debrief after an operation. So the debrief is the point at which, if you've just been out on the ground, doing an operation, the debrief is the point at which you integrate the lessons into your kind of ways of working, SOPs, that kind of thing. So what we want to do is build an objective picture, right? We try and strip out the subjective opinion-based, view of the world, and we say, right, what concretely happened and when? What happened? What were our reactions? Who did what? And you should keep this fact-based and detached. I know it's very easy in retrospectives to, end up in the blame game, or it can be very easy to try and jump down into root causes. But if you try and split the process of, objectively figuring out what happened, and then we can get onto the perspective. So this is where we do that integration piece, where we say, what does it mean? What were the biggest wins and biggest ways? So a great article on this is an article called Anti-Fragile Planning by Taylor Pearson. It's got a really nice sort of treatment of the 80-20 rule applied to learning. So this is where we're really trying to contextualize, what got done, what didn't get done and should have, essentially what lessons do we want to learn, and, what tensions can we begin to resolve. And I think it's very helpful to split the 2 of these up, because, if my experience in many teams is that you try and do this all at once, and very quickly it becomes unclear who's being objective and who's being subjective. And then it can be quite easy to get into, yep, that's the one, Ruben. That's the one. So yeah, it can be quite easy to get into, arguments and conflict. Okay, so then we've done our objective to subjective, and then we're going to start prioritizing, of all of the things that we've seen, which are the ones that we want to actually try and, turn into levers to change our situation. This might be where you also start integrating with the level up. So, if you're at the tactical level, this might be where your operational level then starts to come in and work in what's happened and what's got done and what hasn't got done into, figuring out the next part of the roadmap, for example. In the military, this is experienced as, okay, we've done this, is how we've always done it. This is our SOP. In this case, it hasn't worked for us. We want to try something else. But essentially that's the reason for going through this prioritized phase. So, and this also is taken from that Taylor Pearson article. It's not from him, but he's very good at synthesizing and collecting things. So what's the one thing that we can do, bearing in mind everything that we've just gone through in the debrief? What's the one thing that we can do which makes everything else easier or unnecessary? This is a great little device to, stick out there front and center, so to get people focused. And then we're into the planning part, right? So we've got this kind of, the debrief is the observe and the orient part, and then we want to decide what to do. So this is getting into the planning part. So the planning, if you remember, when I went, the structure of situational awareness is the debrief and the plan. So what we've got is a kind of semi-recursive structure where the debrief, you crunch down all of the information that you've found, all of the experience that you've had, and then the plan is what unfolds from that crunching down. It's a sort of I mean, there's a functional programming term for it, which I'm not going to bore you with, but convergent and divergent thinking. This is where that comes in. You know, if you have a mechanism for that, you can figure out exactly what you can use that mechanism so that you're not sort of jumping all over the place. You've got the converge point, and then the planning part only happens on the bit that you've identified as the highest priority. Stops you spinning your wheels as well, because it's very easy to just try and make plans about everything and end up delivering nothing. So this is a very good quote. This quote has been attributed variously to almost all of the major kind of military leaders in history. No idea who came up with it first. But, you might have heard this. I think Eisenhower said plans are useless, but planning is essential. So this is Winston Churchill's riff on that. So one of the let me just sort of take a little digression to explain how this planning phase works in the military. So there's a very specific communications protocol in the military called the NATO sequence of orders, which is used by all westernized militaries that desire working together. So Americans, UK, Europeans, well, hopefully still Europeans, and it's a very specific step-by-step process which makes sure that everything is thought of. Any major possible derailments are taken into consideration and planned for, and we don't need to do all of that in a business context, but I think there are three parts of it that are very useful. So situation, why are we doing what we're doing? Mission, what is it we're actually going to try and do? And then execution. And this is broadly the structure that the military uses. I mean, they've got lots more words for it, and they break down situation into lots of different parts. Mission is a do what by when in order that type of statement, and it's repeated twice. And then the execution is the whole planning of what are our Meek, that's it, Carl. Yeah. Situation, mission, execution, attachments and communications, I think. Corey, to your point, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. One of the reasons why you would maybe want to go through this whole kind of execution piece is because when you get punched in the mouth, if you haven't thought through the potential of getting punched in the mouth, it's much more of a surprise than if you've worked through, possible kind of roadmap of how we're going to deliver what we want to do. And ways in which we might get punched in the mouth. So, apologies, Richard. I am including a Simon Sinek quote in here. So Richard, who I think is still with us, has bemoaned the frothiness of Simon Sinek and says that if he was ever to become a famous consultant, he would call himself Simon Cynical. Anyway, I digress. So the most important piece, and this is the piece that I think if you're only going to take one thing away from this, if you're in a management or leadership position, my experience of working in technology companies particularly is that the work is delivered as, all right, here's a bunch of stuff that we need to do, right? And if you're lucky enough or unlucky enough in some companies' cases to have been around long enough, why it happens. But the why part never has this kind of conscious calling out of, right, this is why we're all here. This is why we think this is the most important thing. So, if you were part of the last debrief, that's great. You kind of know it. If you weren't, you're missing out. So this is why, this is the landscape. This is why we do Wardley mapping, essentially, right? It's the situation, the terrain. So if your debrief process is quite formal, then, the output of that can be part of this this situation. It can be a line item if you like. And what this is great for is that, and I don't know how many people are in technology companies here, but there's a concept called strategic decision records, or not strategic, sorry, architectural decision records. And what the reason for that is that, you know, turnover in tech companies of both the technology and the people can be quite high. And, you know, code by itself does not particularly well, is not particularly good at communicating context. So it can be quite easy in a tech company to, you know, come across a piece of code in 6 months after it was written and have no idea why it's there. So if you get into the habit of recording, especially now we're all remote, this is even more important. You know, if you get into the habit of recording in some kind of concrete format, this whole kind of process of debrief and planning, the context in which a decision was made can be linked to from the output of the decision, if you like. So, you know, get 2 weeks down the road, you've delivered a feature. In order to help people who come after you understand why that feature is there, you can do something like this, which captures the context. And like I said, you know, Agile is so often about the execution and the whole, you know, integration. What's another good word for that? So integration context is often completely overlooked. And then the mission, right? I very often in my previous sort of career as a technologist have found myself working on okay, sorry. You know, working on a story or a feature, and it's not even really very clearly defined what the thing is, right? There's a whole, maybe some vague description about these are the things that we'll need and these are the things we'll figure out. But actually, in terms of pushing that through to actually delivering a working piece of code, it's often very open to interpretation. So, you know, here's a decent way of, you know, if you are directing people to deliver something, do what, by when, in order that benefit. This is a, you know, pretty good format to express why are things happening and what's going to happen. And then another sort of gripe I have with the way we commonly do things in sort of tactical execution in businesses is, you know, we dive straight into the execution without thinking through, you know, just taking an hour, few minutes, just to look at the external landscape and think through the things that might go wrong. Like if you get halfway through a 2-week period of delivery and something unexpected comes up, you know, you're putting your ability to actually finish that thing at risk. Whereas if you just spend an hour, you know, taking a bit of a higher perspective and thinking through what might happen. So you think through the intent, first of all, right? Because if something does go wrong, you still want to be able to move towards your objective. You think about the biggest risks, and then you think about all the risks or all the assumptions. And then you can think about mitigations for those risks, or what you can do if the assumption proves incorrect. So in the military, this part of the orders process is called actions on. So, okay, we are advancing across this piece of ground towards this objective. What happens if we get contacted from this village that's on the right? Okay, there's a machine gun in there. What do we do? And what actions on gives you is it gives you an immediate reaction to things that you are able to predict. So that's not everything, obviously. The world's unpredictable. But, you know, if you've got peripheral things that might bite you, it's useful to have thought through what mitigations we can put in place immediately so that, you know, when those things do come up, they're not I was listening to a great podcast this morning, you know, the whole kind of the tiger's going to eat you, fight or flight adrenaline response. The podcast was from an Aboriginal researcher, and he said, actually, no, that's a load of nonsense. What we do as Aboriginals when we go into the bush is that we've always got an extremely good situational awareness, and we know where things are. So when things do come up, they're not unexpected, and we have a good to go mitigation strategy so that we don't, panic and run and get eaten. So the other thing to think through when you're thinking about execution is constraint. So, if you've got infinite degrees of freedom, you can move in any direction, you can waste loads of resources. So if you apply some constraints and boundaries, you can funnel your action in a more productive manner often. Oops. And then, milestones and dependency. If that's important, you can think about sequencing of delivery such that you can have a good idea of how far along you are. And then, trade-offs, the more complex you get, the more into complexity or uncertainty you get, the more you're going to have to make trade-offs. And the more trade-offs you make, the more confusion that you potentially store up for yourself. So if you explicitly call out the trade-offs that you're making, and the things that you are potentially pessimizing in future, the things that you're giving up in order to make this trade-off, and they're a part of that record that I mentioned, when you come to the thing that you've done 6 months later and you think, oh my God, this person who, might turn out to be you is an absolute idiot. Why do they do this? It's much easier to actually have that written down and have that kind of contextual understanding than it is to just kind of have to build that whole as you go. So a very good book on the kind of tactical and operational and strategic situational awareness. It's not really about that, but there's a lot of it in there. How these different layers of an organization can interact and work is Team of Teams by Stan McChrystal. So I'm not going to go through this a lot because I'd like to save a bit of time for Q&A. So they talk a lot about shared consciousness and empowered execution. So empowered execution is, tactical situational awareness and action without having to reach up to higher command to check on what you're allowed to do, right? So the boundaries that I mentioned, the constraints are clear, and within those constraints, yeah, sure, Claudius, I'll stick a link in the chat after this. It's actually just called Team of Teams. So within those constraints, you are free to execute, basically at complete will, right? You've got your areas of operation, or whatever other term of deconfliction you need. So you go away and you execute, and then you come back, and shared consciousness is this process of integrating all the lessons that you've learned in tactical execution, so that the information that needs to bubble up, or the change in understanding of the world that needs to happen at the kind of higher levels of an organization, leadership levels, can happen. It's a brilliant book, and also One Mission, the follow-up, is also excellent. And another lesson from Team of Teams was that this kind of the loop that you go through, which is essentially an implementation of the OODA loop. Action leads to more fluid action leads to better observation. Better orientation leads to more accurate action, and it's a reinforcing loop. When Boyd talks about getting inside an opponent's OODA loop, essentially he's talking about disrupting that fluidity and that continuous improvement. And then operational tempo, understanding that the tactical folks need to be able to move as quickly as they possibly can. This is much more relevant for the left-hand side of a Wardley map. It's important everywhere because OODA loops essentially compose together and compound. So any delay at the lower levels is happening more and more. It's like if anyone's got a programming background, this is like speeding up a hot loop in code, right? So empowered execution lets those tactical people execute as quickly as they can. And you do that by pushing authority downwards. Another way you might refer to this is mission command. There's a very well thought of book that I haven't actually read yet called Implementing Mission Command, or is it Implementing? Adopting Mission Command, I think it's called. If anyone knows about that, can you chuck that in the chat? I'm sure there must be some people here who've read it. Okay, SOPs, standing operating procedures. So a lot of what we've talked about is principles, but obviously every organization, be it military or civilian or, emergency services, business, charity, whatever, they all have to get stuff done, right? So standard operating procedures are how you encapsulate emergent good practice. This is something that I think Dave Snowden talks about in the context of Kinefin, which is also, another set of concepts that's quite overlapping with Wardley mapping. You start in Genesis, nothing's clear, everything's a bit chaotic. As you figure stuff out and you move something into a commodity or a product, you will inherently start capturing repeatable blocks of work and making them more efficient. And that's the emergence of SOPs. They should always be evolving. So a friend of mine that I was in training with, a very basic training with in the Royal Marines, a very uncomfortable number of years ago, stayed in the Marines a bit longer than me, became a sniper. And when we caught up in London, he was telling me that, one of the things that had to evolve really, really quickly in Afghanistan was the way they moved around. So, in training or in most operational contexts, like in Northern Ireland, for example, which is one sort of operational environment that we were heavily involved with, you would always try and stay close to cover, right? Cover and move, cover and move. You'd always stay close to a wall or something. Now, that's great until the Taliban start embedding explosives into walls, right? So what they did in Afghanistan instead was they started realizing that wasn't working very well, very painfully and very, in a very costly manner. But they also realized that the Taliban weren't great shots. So they decided that they would rather be 10 feet into a field and being shot at than hugging cover and being blown up. And that's a concrete example of an SOP that evolves, right? So as a new guy coming into Afghanistan, you would expect to do something the way you've done it before, but actually in this context, the SOP is different because, it's been tested and adjusted. And this is where, standardization where possible, right? So standardization is great until it becomes dogma. When it becomes dogma, it often gets in the way. And then there's a bit in the book about essentially they build cross-functional teams. I'm going to whiz through this because it's not super relevant. So here's an example of a much more, high fidelity OODA loop, right? I think it can be quite confusing looking at the OODA. It can be quite confusing looking at the OODA loop diagram, the one I showed at the beginning. So this is a bit more kind of context about, this is the diagrammatic version of what I've just spoken about, unfolding action with the real world. New repertoires is creating new SOPs, essentially. Observation and orientation is situational awareness. I'm going to skip over this because I think we've covered most of it already. And I'm going to throw it open to discussion and Q&A.